At Christmas dinner, my wife of 23 years stood up and announced, "And our kids voted you out, and we banned you from calling U.S. family." I smiled and handed her an envelope. "Here is one last gift for you." As soon as she opened it, she collapsed in shock. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and let US know where you're listening from in the comments. Chapter 1. The Perfect Family Facade. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and for 23 years, I believed I was living the American dream. I had built Blackwood Construction from the ground up, starting with nothing but calloused hands and an unbreakable will. By 45, I owned the largest construction company in our state, employed over 300 people, and had enough money to ensure my family never wanted for anything. My wife, Catherine Blackwood, was once the envy of every woman in our affluent neighborhood of Pinehurst Estates. At 42, she maintained her figure through expensive yoga classes and personal trainers, her auburn hair always perfectly styled, her wardrobe consisting of designer pieces that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had been a real estate agent when we met, successful in her own right, but after our children were born, she chose to focus on being a full-time mother and socialite. Our children were the crown jewels of our existence, or so I thought. Emma, 21, was a senior at Stanford studying business, preparing to eventually take over the family company. She had inherited my drive and Catherine's social grace, making her popular and successful in everything she touched. Then there was James, 19, a sophomore at UCLA majoring in architecture. He was quieter than his sister, but equally brilliant, with an artistic soul that balanced my pragmatic nature perfectly. We lived in a sprawling 8-bedroom mansion that I had designed and built myself, complete with a home theater, wine cellar, and a pool that could rival any resort. Every Christmas, our home became the centerpiece of neighborhood celebrations, with Catherine orchestrating elaborate dinner parties that were featured in the local society pages. But success, I learned, can make you blind to the rot festering beneath the surface. The first crack in my perfect world appeared 6 months ago, though I didn't recognize it then. Catherine had become increasingly distant, claiming she needed space to find herself. She started taking weekend trips with her sister Linda, supposedly to spa retreats and shopping excursions in the city. When she returned, she seemed refreshed but somehow different, secretive, almost giddy with some private joke I wasn't part of. Our intimate moments became non-existent. When I tried to discuss it, Catherine would deflect with complaints about being tired or stressed about some charity function she was organizing. I threw myself deeper into work, convincing myself it was just a phase. After all, we had weathered rough patches before. What marriage of over 2 decades hadn't? The children seemed to sense the tension. Emma, home from college for spring break, had been unusually cold toward me, treating my attempts at conversation with barely concealed irritation. James, typically my ally in family dynamics, began avoiding our traditional one-on-one time working on construction projects in my workshop. I attributed their behavior to typical young adult independence, the natural process of children pulling away from their parents as they forge their own identities. I was wrong about everything. The second crack came in the form of hushed phone conversations. Catherine would step outside to take calls, claiming they were about charity work or complaints from difficult clients she was helping find homes. But charity coordinators don't typically call at midnight, and real estate emergencies don't require the kind of breathy, intimate whispers I occasionally overheard through our bedroom window. Still, I trusted. Marcus Blackwood, the man who had built an empire by reading people and situations with laser precision, chose to trust the woman who had stood beside him for over 2 decades. The man who never made a business deal without thoroughly investigating every angle became willfully blind when it came to his own wife. The third crack came during our annual 4th of July barbecue. Catherine had invited several new faces to our usual gathering, including a man named Derek Stone. He was younger than me, maybe 38, with the kind of lean, artistic build that comes from rock climbing and yoga rather than the construction work that had built my more substantial frame. He worked as a high-end interior designer, specializing in luxury homes for wealthy clients. Derek was charming, funny, and knowledgeable about art, and culture in ways that made my business-focused conversations seem crude by comparison. He complimented Catherine on everything from her choice of wine to her landscaping decisions, and she practically glowed under his attention. When he mentioned he was recently divorced and new to the area, Catherine was quick to offer help in finding him the perfect home. That night, as we cleaned up after our guests, Catherine was more animated than I'd seen her in months. She talked excitedly about Derek's potential as a client, about his sophisticated tastes and successful business. When I made a casual comment about his obvious interest in her, she laughed it off as ridiculous, claiming I was being paranoid. But Marcus Blackwood didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by ignoring his instincts, and every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings I chose not to hear. The final crack that shattered my willful blindness came 3 months later, in late October. I had returned home early from a job site due to her equipment breakdown, eager to surprise Catherine with an impromptu lunch date. Her car was in the driveway alongside a sleek black BMW I recognized immediately. I entered through the kitchen, calling out to announce my presence, but received no response. The house felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I moved through the first floor methodically, my construction boots silent on the hardwood floors I had personally installed years earlier. The sounds drifting down from our master bedroom suite were unmistakable. The rhythmic creaking of our bed frame, the breathless moans I hadn't heard from my wife in over a year, and underneath it all, a man's voice whispering things that made my blood turn to ice. I stood at the bottom of the staircase for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to my wife of 23 years being intimate with another man in the bed where our children had been conceived. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever endured, but beneath the pain, something else began to grow. Cold, calculating rage. I left the house as quietly as I had entered, driving aimlessly through the city until the shaking in my hands subsided and I could think clearly again. By the time I returned home that evening, Catherine was in the kitchen preparing dinner as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and asked about my day with the same casual interest she had shown for 23 years. That night, as she lay sleeping beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. Marcus Blackwood had built his success by being patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. The same skills that had created my empire would now be used to destroy those who had betrayed me. I would not confront Catherine immediately. I would not demand explanations or beg for reconciliation. Instead, I would do what I did best. I would plan, prepare, and execute a strategy so comprehensive that my enemies would be destroyed before they even realized they were under attack. The game had begun, and I had never lost a game in my life. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. 3 days after discovering Catherine's betrayal, I made a decision that went against every emotional impulse screaming in my head. Instead of confronting her, instead of hiring the first divorce attorney I could find, I chose to do what had made me successful in business: gather intelligence before making any moves. I hired a private investigator named Samuel Rodriguez, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. Sam was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an ability to blend into any environment. More importantly, he was discreet and thorough, qualities I valued above all else in this situation. I need to know everything, I told him during our first meeting in his downtown office. How long it's been going on, where they meet, what they talk about, who else knows. I want a complete picture before I make any decisions. Sam nodded, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. In cases like this, Mr. Blackwood, the betrayal often runs deeper than just the affair. People change their behavior patterns, their social circles, their priorities. Sometimes family members know more than they let on. His words hit me like a physical blow, but I maintained my composure. You think my children might know? It's possible. Adult children often pick up on marital problems before the betrayed spouse does. They might not know specifics, but they sense changes in family dynamics. Sometimes they even feel forced to choose sides. The possibility that Emma and James might have known about their mother's affair, while I remained oblivious, added another layer of humiliation to my situation. But if they had chosen to protect Catherine's secret instead of warning me, that betrayal would demand its own response. While Sam began his investigation, I maintained the facade of normalcy at home. I went to work each morning, returned each evening, and played the role of devoted husband and father. Catherine seemed to sense no change in my behavior, continuing her routine of charity events, shopping trips, and what I now knew were clandestine meetings with Derek Stone. The first report arrived a week later, and it painted a picture that was somehow worse than I had imagined. Catherine and Derek's relationship wasn't a recent development born of momentary weakness. According to Sam's findings, they had been involved for over 8 months, meeting regularly at a downtown apartment Derek maintained as his design studio. Phone records showed hundreds of text messages and calls between them, often late at night or early in the morning. Credit card statements revealed expensive dinners at romantic restaurants, weekend trips to luxury hotels, and purchases of intimate apparel from boutiques I had never heard of Catherine mention. But the most damaging evidence came in the form of photographs and audio recordings. Sam had managed to document several of their meetings, capturing not just their physical intimacy, but also their conversations about their future together. In one particularly devastating recording, Catherine talked about her plans to divorce me and take half of everything I had built. "Marcus is so predictable," she had said, her voice filled with a contempt I had never heard before. "He's so focused on his precious company that he has no idea what's happening right under his nose. When I leave him, he'll be so devastated he won't even fight the settlement. I'll get the house, half the business, and probably alimony for life." Derek's response was equally revealing. "What about the kids? Will they be a problem?" Emma and James understand that their father is a workaholic who never really prioritized family. They've already started distancing themselves from him. By the time I file for divorce, they'll be firmly on my side. The recording continued for another 20 minutes, detailing their plans to move to California together once Catherine's divorce was finalized. They discussed selling the house I had built with my own hands, liquidating assets, and starting fresh with what Derek called Marcus's money. But perhaps the most crushing revelation came when Sam presented evidence that Emma and James were not just aware of their mother's affair. They were actively supporting it. Phone records showed regular communication between the children and Derek. Emma had even had dinner with Derek and Catherine multiple times, treating him as her mother's boyfriend rather than her father's betrayer. James had been more subtle in his support, but no less complicit. He had provided alibis for Catherine's weekend trips, lying directly to my face when I asked about her whereabouts. During one recorded conversation, he had actually advised Catherine on the best way to hide assets before filing for divorce. As I reviewed Sam's reports in my home office late one evening, I felt something inside me die. The family I had worked so hard to provide for, the people I would have died to protect, had not only betrayed me, but were actively conspiring to destroy me financially and emotionally. Catherine entered the office as I was locking the reports in my desk drawer. She was dressed for bed in an expensive silk nightgown, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face perfectly. She looked beautiful, desirable, and completely foreign to me. "Working late again?" she asked, moving to massage my shoulders with practiced familiarity. "You've been so tense lately. Maybe we should plan a vacation, just the two of us. We could go to that resort in Tuscany you've always talked about visiting." I looked up at her, this woman who had shared my bed for over 2 decades, who had borne my children, who had been my partner in building our life together. She was suggesting a romantic vacation while planning to leave me and take everything I had worked for. The audacity of it would have been impressive if it weren't so destructive. "That sounds wonderful," I replied, covering her hand with mine. "Let's plan it for after the holidays. Things should be calmer then." She smiled and leaned down to kiss my forehead. "I love you, Marcus. I hope you know that." The lie rolled off her tongue so easily that I wondered how many others she had told over the years. How many times had she looked into my eyes and professed love while planning my destruction? After she left, I sat in the darkness of my office and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would not simply divorce Catherine and move on. I would not allow her to take half of everything I had built and walk away to start a new life with her lover. I would not let my children's betrayal go unpunished. Marcus Blackwood had never been a man who forgave and forgot. In business, those who crossed me learned quickly that there were consequences for their actions. My family would learn the same lesson, but the price they paid would be far higher than anything I had ever exacted in the business world. I opened my laptop and began making lists, names, resources, strategies. By dawn, I had the skeleton of a plan that would not only destroy Catherine and Derek, but would ensure that everyone who had betrayed me understood the cost of their choices. The game was no longer just beginning. Now, it was time to start playing for keeps. Chapter 3. Setting the Trap. The beauty of a well-executed plan lies not in its complexity, but in its inevitability. Over the next 2 months, I began laying the groundwork for what would become the most comprehensive and devastating revenge strategy one had ever conceived. Every move was calculated, every contingency planned, and every outcome designed to maximize the destruction of those who had betrayed me. My first priority was securing my financial assets. Through my attorney, Robert Thorne, a man I had used for business deals for over 15 years, I began quietly restructuring my holdings. I transferred ownership of several properties to offshore entities, moved investments into accounts Catherine couldn't access, and established legal frameworks that would protect the bulk of my wealth from any divorce settlement. This is some sophisticated asset protection work, Marcus, Robert observed during one of our late-night meetings at his office. Are you expecting some kind of legal trouble? Let's just say I believe in being prepared for any possibility, I replied. I didn't build what I have by leaving things to chance. Robert nodded, understanding the unspoken message. He had seen enough wealthy clients go through ugly divorces to recognize the signs of a man preparing for war. While I fortified my financial position, Sam continued his surveillance of Catherine and Derek. The evidence he gathered painted an increasingly clear picture of their relationship and their plans for my destruction. They had become careless in their confidence, meeting openly at expensive restaurants and making plans with the certainty of people who believed they held all the cards. But the most valuable intelligence Sam provided involved Derek Stone himself. A thorough background investigation revealed that Catherine's lover was not the successful businessman he appeared to be. His interior design business was struggling financially, kept afloat only by loans from friends and family. He had been through 2 previous divorces, both of which had ended with accusations of infidelity and financial impropriety. More importantly, Derek had a weakness that I could exploit. He was a gambling addict with significant debts to some very dangerous people. His polished exterior and artistic sophistication masked a man desperate for money and willing to do anything to get it. This information gave me the key to the first phase of my plan. Through intermediaries, I arranged for Derek to be invited to several high-stakes poker games around the city. The games were legitimate, but the players were carefully selected, men I knew to be skilled, patient, and utterly ruthless when it came to collecting debts. Derek's gambling addiction made him easy prey, and within 3 weeks, he had accumulated over $200,000 in debt to people who did not accept "I'll pay you later" as a viable option. When Derek inevitably turned to Catherine for financial help, she made a crucial mistake. She began taking money from our joint accounts to cover his debts. Sam documented every transaction, every withdrawal, every transfer that could be traced back to Derek's gambling losses. Under state law, using marital assets to fund an affair partner's debts was not only grounds for divorce, but could be considered theft. While Catherine unknowingly built the case for her own destruction, I turned my attention to my children's betrayal. Emma and James had chosen their side in this family war, and they would face the consequences of that choice. Emma's weakness was her pride and her absolute certainty that she deserved everything she had been given. She had grown up wealthy and entitled, never having to work for anything, never having to face real consequences for her actions. She attended Stanford on my money, drove a BMW I had purchased for her 21st birthday, and lived in an expensive apartment I funded without question. James was different, quieter, more thoughtful, but ultimately just as complicit in the family betrayal. His weakness was his artistic nature and his complete financial dependence on me for his education and lifestyle. I began by subtly altering their circumstances. Emma's credit card, which I paid monthly, started being declined for unnecessary purchases. When she called to complain, I explained that there had been some temporary issues with cash flow due to a delayed project payment. James found his monthly allowance reduced by half, with similar explanations about business fluctuations. More significantly, I began the process of removing them from any inheritance or trust arrangements I had established. My attorney restructured my will and estate planning documents, ensuring that my assets would go to charity rather than to children who had betrayed me. It was a cold decision, but Marcus Blackwood had not built his success by allowing emotions to override practical considerations. The third phase of my plan involved Derek Stone more directly. Using information Sam had gathered about Derek's business struggles, I began systematically undermining his professional reputation. Through a network of contacts in the construction and real estate industries, word spread that Derek was unreliable, financially unstable, and impossible to work with. Potential clients who might have hired him found themselves steered toward my competitors instead. Within 6 weeks, Derek's business was in complete collapse. Without new clients and with existing projects being canceled, he found himself unable to pay even basic business expenses. The gambling debts that Catherine had been helping him cover became impossible to manage, and the dangerous men he owed money to began making their displeasure known in increasingly direct ways. The beauty of this approach was that Derek never suspected I was involved. To him, his problems seemed like a series of unfortunate coincidences, bad luck in a competitive industry. He had no idea that every setback, every canceled contract, every financial disaster had been carefully orchestrated by the husband of the woman he was sleeping with. As December approached and our traditional Christmas plans took shape, I prepared for the final phase of my strategy. Christmas had always been Catherine's favorite holiday, the time when she most enjoyed playing the role of the perfect wife and mother. Our annual Christmas dinner was an elaborate affair, with the finest food, expensive wine, and an atmosphere of family unity that would be photographed for the society pages. This year's Christmas dinner would be different. This year, it would serve as the stage for the complete destruction of everyone who had betrayed me. Sam provided the final pieces of evidence I needed, recordings of Catherine and Derek planning to announce their relationship immediately after the holidays, documentation of the money Catherine had stolen from our accounts, and proof of my children's ongoing collaboration in their mother's deception. I also discovered that Catherine had already retained a divorce attorney and was planning to serve me with papers on December 26th, apparently believing that the shock of post-holiday depression would make me more likely to accept an unfavorable settlement. She had no idea that I had been planning my own surprise for months. On Christmas Eve, as I watched Catherine bustling around our home, preparing for what she believed would be her last Christmas as Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction settle over me. Everything was in place. Every contingency had been planned for. Every betrayer would face the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow, the Blackwood family would gather for Christmas dinner as we had for 23 years. But this time, instead of celebrating the bonds that held us together, we would witness the complete destruction of those bonds. And I would emerge from the wreckage as the only survivor, having learned the most valuable lesson of my life, that the only person you can truly trust is yourself. Chapter 4. The Christmas Revelation. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of perfect winter weather that made our neighborhood look like a scene from a holiday postcard. Snow had fallen overnight, covering our manicured lawn and the bare branches of the oak trees I had planted when we first moved into the house. Inside our mansion, Catherine bustled about making final preparations for our traditional Christmas dinner, her excitement palpable as she arranged flowers and adjusted place settings with the precision of a military operation. Emma and James had arrived Christmas Eve, their arms full of presents and their attitudes toward me unchanged from recent months, polite but distant, as if they were humoring an elderly relative rather than celebrating with their father. They helped Catherine with preparations while making casual conversation about their college experiences, their future plans, and everything except the elephant in the room that only I knew existed. Derek Stone would not be joining us for dinner, at least not physically. According to Sam's latest report, Derek was currently hiding out in a seedy motel across town, trying to avoid the increasingly violent debt collectors who had been visiting his apartment and office with growing frequency. The gambling debts Catherine had been covering had grown beyond her ability to manage, and Derek's business collapse had left him with no legitimate income to pay his obligations. But Derek's presence would be felt at our dinner table nonetheless, through the evidence I had compiled and the revelations I was prepared to share. As afternoon approached and Catherine began the final preparations for our meal, I retreated to my home office to review everything one last time. The envelope sat on my desk, a simple manila folder containing documents that would detonate like a nuclear bomb in the middle of our family gathering. Inside were photographs, financial records, audio transcripts, and legal documents that would not only expose Catherine's betrayal, but demonstrate the complicity of our children in her deception. More importantly, the envelope contained the consequences of their choices. Divorce papers that would leave Catherine with almost nothing, evidence of theft that could result in criminal charges, and documentation showing that Emma and James had been removed from all family trusts and inheritance arrangements. The final piece of my strategy involved Derek Stone's current predicament. Through carefully orchestrated events, I had ensured that Derek's gambling debts would come due in a particularly dramatic fashion today. The men he owed money to had been informed that he would be receiving a large sum of money from his girlfriend today, money they expected to be used to settle his debts immediately. Of course, Derek would not be receiving any money from Catherine, because Catherine would soon have problems of her own to deal with. But the debt collectors didn't know that, and their impatience with Derek's continued delays would likely manifest in ways that would make his day even more challenging than Catherine's. At 4 o'clock, our guests began arriving. Catherine's sister Linda came first, followed by my brother Michael and his wife Sarah. Catherine's parents, Robert and Margaret Harrison, arrived fashionably late, as was their custom. The conversations were warm and familiar, filled with holiday cheer and the comfortable rhythms of family traditions that had been established over decades. Catherine was in her element, playing the perfect hostess in the dining room she had decorated with fresh holly and silver candlesticks. She wore a deep red dress that complemented her auburn hair and jewelry I had given her for previous Christmas celebrations. To any observer, she appeared to be a woman completely content with her life and family. Emma and James moved through the gathering with the easy confidence of young adults who had grown up in privileged circumstances. Emma regaled the family with stories from Stanford, while James discussed his architectural studies and showed sketches of buildings he hoped to design someday. They seemed genuinely happy, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse around them. As we gathered around the dining room table for the main course, I took my traditional place at the head of the table, with Catherine at the opposite end. The table was set with our finest china and crystal. The centerpiece was a masterpiece of seasonal flowers, and the food Catherine had prepared was worthy of the finest restaurants. For 23 years, this had been the highlight of our family's year, a time when we came together to celebrate not just the holiday, but everything we had built together. The irony that this gathering would serve as the stage for the complete destruction of our family was not lost on me. The conversation flowed easily through the appetizer and main course. We discussed business, travel plans, the children's academic achievements, and neighborhood gossip. Catherine was particularly animated, talking about the charity work she had been doing and her plans for the new year. She had no idea that her new year would be drastically different from anything she was imagining. As Catherine began clearing the dishes and preparing to serve dessert, I stood up and tapped my wine glass with a spoon to get everyone's attention. The table fell silent, all eyes turning to me with the expectation that I was about to deliver the kind of warm, sentimental toast that had become traditional at our Christmas gatherings. Before we have dessert, I began, my voice calm and measured. I have something I need to share with all of you. This has been a year of revelations for me, a year of learning some very important truths about the people closest to me. Catherine looked puzzled, but not alarmed. Emma and James exchanged glances, perhaps sensing something in my tone that the others missed. The extended family members settled back in their chairs, expecting some kind of heartfelt speech about gratitude and family bonds. That's when Catherine stood up abruptly, her face suddenly flushed with what appeared to be nervous energy. "Actually, Marcus, I have something to say first," she announced, her voice carrying a tremor I had never heard before. This seemed like the perfect time to share some news with the family. She looked around the table, gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. Emma and James sat up straighter in their chairs, and I realized with sudden clarity that they knew what was coming. This had been planned, rehearsed, and orchestrated without my knowledge. "Marcus," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "and our kids voted you out, and we banned you from calling us family." The words hit the room like a physical force. Catherine's parents gasped audibly, my brother Michael's mouth fell open, and Linda looked like she had been slapped. But Emma and James sat calmly, their expressions serious but not surprised. They had known this was coming. They had participated in planning it. Catherine continued, her confidence building as she spoke. "We've decided that your obsession with work, your emotional unavailability, and your controlling behavior have made it impossible for us to continue this charade of a happy family. We want you to move out of the house, and we want you to stay away from us while we figure out how to move forward." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear someone's nervous breathing, could hear the sound of my own heart beating with perfect calm rhythm. Then I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a sad smile or even an angry smile. It was the kind of smile I gave to business competitors who had just made a fatal strategic error, calm, confident, and completely without mercy. "That's interesting, Catherine," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket to withdraw the manila envelope I had prepared. "Because I have something for you, too. One last gift." I handed her the envelope with steady hands, my smile never wavering as I watched her face. "I think you should open it now, in front of everyone. After all, if we're sharing family news, we might as well share all of it." Catherine took the envelope with hands that were suddenly trembling. Emma and James looked confused now, their confidence beginning to waver as they sensed that something was not going according to their plan. Catherine opened the envelope and began to read the first document inside. I watched her face go from confusion to shock to absolute horror as she realized what she was looking at. The color drained from her cheeks, her hands began to shake violently, and her legs seemed to give out beneath her. She collapsed back in her chair with a strangled gasp, the contents of the envelope scattering across the table for everyone to see. Photographs of her with Derek Stone in intimate situations, financial records showing money she had stolen from our accounts, transcripts of conversations where she discussed her plans to destroy me, and legal documents that would strip her of everything she had taken for granted. But the real shock came when she saw the final document in the pile, a restraining order that had been issued against Derek Stone that very morning, based on evidence of harassment and threats I had manufactured through carefully orchestrated circumstances. Derek was now legally prohibited from contacting Catherine or coming within 500 feet of our home. "Derek's been arrested," I said calmly, as Catherine stared at the documents with eyes wide with terror. "Something about outstanding warrants and debts to some very unforgiving people. I believe he's currently in county lockup, trying to make bail he can't afford." The silence at the table was complete now. Catherine's parents looked horrified as they took in the photographic evidence of their daughter's betrayal. My brother Michael was studying the financial documents with the trained eye of an accountant. Linda was staring at Catherine with a mixture of shock and disgust. But it was Emma and James' reactions that interested me most. They looked stunned, not by their mother's affair. They had known about that, but by the comprehensive nature of my evidence and the legal consequences that were now unfolding before their eyes. "You see," I continued, my voice still perfectly calm, "while you three were planning my destruction, I was planning yours. Every move you made, every secret you thought you were keeping, every plan you hatched, I was watching, documenting, and preparing." I looked directly at Emma. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your little dinner dates with Derek? About the advice you gave your mother on hiding assets?" Then I turned to James. "And did you honestly believe I wouldn't discover your role in providing alibis and lying to my face about your mother's whereabouts?" Both of my children looked like they had been struck. The confidence and entitlement they had carried into this dinner had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that their actions had consequences they had never considered. "Catherine," I said, finally addressing my wife directly, "you'll find in that envelope that divorce papers have already been filed. You'll also find documentation of your theft of marital assets, which constitutes a felony in this state. And you'll discover that the prenuptial agreement you signed 23 years ago is still very much in effect." Catherine tried to speak, but only managed a strangled whisper. "Marcus, please, we can work this out." "No," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her plea like a blade. "We can't work this out. You made your choice when you decided to betray me. Emma and James made their choice when they decided to help you. Now you all get to live with the consequences of those choices." I stood up from the table, straightening my jacket and looking around at the faces of people who had once been my family. "I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown while you make arrangements to find somewhere else to live. The house will be sold as part of the divorce settlement, though given the prenuptial agreement and your theft of marital assets, your share will be substantially smaller than you anticipated." The room remained frozen as I walked toward the door. Catherine's parents looked stricken, my brother appeared to be in shock, and Linda was clutching her wine glass with white knuckles. As I reached the doorway, I turned back for one final look at the scene I had orchestrated. Catherine sat collapsed in her chair, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal. Emma and James stared at their hands, finally understanding that their comfortable, privileged world had just come to an end. "Oh, and one more thing," I added, almost as an afterthought. "Emma, James, you'll find that your trust funds have been dissolved and your college funding has been terminated. After all, I wouldn't want to continue supporting people who voted me out of the family." The sound that escaped from Emma's throat was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. James looked up at me with eyes that were wide with panic. "Marcus, you can't," Catherine began. "I can, and I have," I replied. "You wanted to vote me out of the family, Catherine. Congratulations. You got exactly what you asked for." I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer I had designed, and out the front door of the house I had built with my own hands. Behind me, I could hear the sound of voices raised in panic, confusion, and growing despair. As I drove away from Pinehurst Estates for what I knew would be the last time as a resident, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete and total satisfaction. The war was over, and I had won. Chapter 5. The Fallout Begins. The Marriott's penthouse suite became my command center for the next phase of what I had begun to think of as the complete reconstruction of my life. From my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city I had helped build spread out below me. Buildings that bore my company's signature, neighborhoods where my crews had laid foundations, infrastructure projects that would outlast everyone who had betrayed me. It had been 3 days since Christmas dinner, and the aftermath was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. Sam Rodriguez continued to provide updates on the chaos erupting in my former family's life, and each report brought me a sense of satisfaction that I had never experienced in any business victory. Catherine's first mistake after I left had been trying to contact Derek Stone. She had driven directly to his apartment Christmas night, only to discover that he was indeed in county lockup, held on charges related to his gambling debts and a minor assault charge that had been cleverly manufactured by men who wanted their money. When she tried to post bail, she discovered that her credit cards had been frozen pending the theft investigation, and our joint bank accounts had been emptied according to legal procedures outlined in the divorce filing. Her second mistake was underestimating how quickly word of our family's dramatic collapse would spread through Pinehurst Estates. By December 27th, everyone in our social circle knew about the affair, the theft charges, and the spectacular Christmas dinner confrontation. Catherine's carefully cultivated reputation as the perfect wife and mother had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Emma and James had made their own series of crucial errors. After realizing that their college funding had indeed been terminated, they had attempted to contact me through various intermediaries, including their Aunt Linda and my brother Michael. Every message was the same. They claimed they had been manipulated by their mother, that they hadn't understood the full scope of her deception, and that they wanted to reconcile with me. These attempts at reconciliation revealed the depth of their entitlement and their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was. Marcus Blackwood had not built a construction empire by being forgiving or sentimental. When someone betrayed me, they faced consequences. When those consequences proved insufficient, they faced escalation. There are no second chances in my world, no forgiveness for disloyalty, and no exceptions for blood relatives. My attorney, Robert Thorne, handled the legal aspects of the divorce with ruthless efficiency. The prenuptial agreement Catherine had signed 23 years earlier was ironclad, drafted by one of the city's most skilled family law attorneys and designed to protect my assets in exactly this situation. Combined with the documented evidence of her theft and adultery, Catherine's position was legally untenable. She's retained Gloria Martinez as her attorney. Robert informed me during one of our meetings. Martinez is good, but she's working with a client who has no credible defense and no financial resources to mount a serious challenge. Catherine's going to get destroyed in court. What about the criminal charges? I asked. The district attorney's office is taking the theft charges seriously. We're talking about over $300,000 in marital assets used to fund her lover's gambling debts. That's felony territory, and given the documentary evidence, conviction is almost certain. The criminal charges were particularly satisfying because they meant Catherine would face consequences beyond just losing her comfortable lifestyle. A felony conviction would destroy any remaining social standing she might have retained, eliminate her ability to work in real estate or any other licensed profession, and serve as a permanent reminder of the price of betraying me. But the legal victories were only part of the satisfaction I derived from watching my former family's world collapse. The real pleasure came from observing how quickly their support systems evaporated once their circumstances changed. Catherine's parents, Robert and Margaret Harrison, had initially been sympathetic to their daughter's situation. But as the evidence of her betrayal became undeniable and the criminal charges made headlines in the society pages, they began distancing themselves from the scandal. By New Year's Eve, they had made it clear that Catherine could not move back into their home and that they would not be providing financial support for her legal defense. Catherine's sister Linda, who had been her closest confidant and alleged accomplice in providing alibis for the affair, suddenly discovered pressing reasons to be unavailable when Catherine needed help. The weekend shopping trips and spa retreats they had enjoyed together became memories as Linda focused on protecting her own family's reputation from association with the scandal. Emma and James found their social circles at Stanford and UCLA becoming significantly less welcoming as news of their family's disgrace spread through their affluent networks. The wealthy families who had once welcomed them as equals now viewed them as cautionary tales, examples of what happened when privilege was taken for granted and family loyalty was discarded for convenience. More practically, both children faced immediate financial crises that their entitled upbringings had left them completely unprepared to handle. Emma's expensive apartment near Stanford became unaffordable without her monthly allowance, and James discovered that his artistic pursuits at UCLA would have to be replaced with actual employment if he wanted to continue his education. Their attempt to find work revealed another consequence of their privileged backgrounds. They had no meaningful job skills, no work experience, and no understanding of how to survive without the financial safety net I had provided their entire lives. Emma's applications for internships and entry-level positions were rejected when background checks revealed her family's legal problems, and James found that his artistic talents held little value in the practical job market. The speed with which their comfortable world collapsed served as a harsh education in reality for children who had never faced genuine consequences for their actions. But their education was far from complete. Derek Stone's situation had deteriorated even more dramatically than my former family's. The gambling debts I had helped orchestrate had placed him in a dangerous position with men who resolved disputes through violence rather than legal proceedings. After being released from county lockup on bail he couldn't afford, paid by a bail bondsman who now owned his assets as collateral, Derek discovered that his apartment had been vandalized and his car had been repossessed. More significantly, Derek learned that his professional reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that no potential client would consider hiring him. The whisper campaign I had orchestrated through my industry contacts had been devastatingly effective, painting him as unreliable, financially irresponsible, and professionally incompetent. Without income, without assets, and with mounting legal bills from both the criminal charges and the divorce proceedings, Derek found himself trapped in a spiral of consequences that grew worse with each passing day. The sophisticated, charming man who had seduced my wife had been reduced to sleeping in cheap motels and borrowing money from increasingly reluctant friends. The final element of Derek's destruction came when the men he owed gambling debts to decided that patience was no longer a viable strategy. According to Sam's reports, Derek had been hospitalized after a construction accident that bore all the hallmarks of a violent reminder about overdue payments. He would recover from his injuries, but the message had been delivered clearly. Debts would be paid, one way or another. As I reviewed Sam's latest reports from my suite at the Marriott, I felt a sense of completeness that had been missing from my life for months. Every person who had betrayed me was now facing consequences that matched the magnitude of their disloyalty. Every element of the comfortable life they had taken for granted was being systematically stripped away. But this was only the beginning. The legal proceedings would take months to resolve, during which time Catherine, Emma, James, and Derek would experience the full weight of their choices. They would learn what it meant to live without the protection and provision I had given them for decades. They would also learn that Marcus Blackwood was not a man who forgave or forgot. The systematic destruction of their lives would serve as both punishment for their betrayal and a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing me in the future. As evening fell over the city, I poured myself a glass of the finest whiskey money could buy and stood at my windows, looking out over the empire I had built through determination, intelligence, and absolute ruthlessness when necessary. Tomorrow would bring new developments in the ongoing collapse of my former family's world, new evidence of their desperation, and new confirmation that justice, my justice, was being served. The game was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. I had already won. Chapter 6. The Desperation Phase. 2 weeks into the new year, the true scope of my former family's desperation began to manifest in ways that were both predictable and satisfying. From my penthouse suite, I continued to orchestrate their destruction while maintaining the appearance of a man simply moving on with his life after a painful divorce. Catherine's situation had deteriorated rapidly. The criminal theft charges had made headlines in the local newspaper society section, complete with details about the affair and the Christmas dinner confrontation that had exposed everything. Her reputation in Pinehurst Estates and the broader community was now permanently destroyed, and the social circle she had cultivated for over 2 decades had abandoned her completely. More practically, Catherine had been forced to move out of our mansion and into a modest apartment in a less desirable part of town. The prenuptial agreement and her theft of marital assets meant she would receive virtually nothing from our divorce settlement, leaving her to survive on what remained of her personal savings and whatever employment she could find. But Catherine's biggest challenge was not financial, it was psychological. For 23 years, she had defined herself through her role as Mrs. Marcus Blackwood, the successful construction magnate's wife. Without that identity, without the social status and financial security it provided, she was struggling to understand who she was or how to function in the world. According to Sam's surveillance reports, Catherine spent most of her days in her apartment, emerging only for court appearances and occasional trips to buy necessities. She had lost weight, her carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated, and she displayed signs of the kind of depression that comes from watching one's entire world collapse. Her attempts to contact me had grown increasingly desperate. Phone calls, text messages, emails, and even letters delivered through her attorney all carried the same themes. She claimed the affair had been a mistake, that she still loved me, that we could work through our problems if I would just give her another chance. These pleas revealed Catherine's fundamental misunderstanding of both the situation and my character. She seemed to believe that her betrayal was a temporary setback that could be overcome through negotiation or emotional manipulation. She had no comprehension that her actions had permanently severed any bond between us and that her fate was now sealed. Emma and James had pursued different strategies in their desperation, but both had proven equally futile. Emma had initially tried to use her relationship with my brother Michael to arrange a reconciliation meeting. When that failed, she had attempted to leverage her academic achievements at Stanford suggesting that cutting off her education funding would waste the investment I had already made in her future. When that approach also failed, she had resorted to direct confrontation, showing up at my office building and demanding to see me. My security team had handled Emma's visit exactly as I had instructed. They had escorted her from the building after informing her that she was no longer welcome on company property. The encounter had been recorded by security cameras, creating a permanent record of her desperation and my unwillingness to engage with her. James had taken a more subtle approach, reaching out through mutual friends and attempting to arrange casual encounters where we might accidentally meet. These efforts had also failed, partly because I had anticipated them and partly because the scandal surrounding our family had made many of our former friends reluctant to become involved in our dispute. Both children had been forced to withdraw from their expensive universities and find employment to support themselves. Emma had managed to secure a position as a hostess at an upscale restaurant, while James had found work as a barista at a coffee shop near his former campus. The contrast between their current circumstances and their previous lives of privilege was stark and intentional. But their employment situations were temporary at best. Background checks for better positions consistently revealed their family's legal problems, and their lack of real-world skills made them poor candidates for advancement. They were trapped in a cycle of low-paying service jobs with no clear path to improvement. The psychological impact on both children was severe. They had grown up believing that their father's success guaranteed their own comfortable futures, never considering that their inheritance and financial security were dependent on maintaining family loyalty. The realization that their betrayal had cost them everything they had taken for granted was devastating to their sense of identity and self-worth. Derek Stone's situation had become genuinely dangerous. The gambling debts I had helped create had grown through interest and penalties to over $400,000, an amount that was impossible for him to pay given his destroyed business and mounting legal expenses. The men he owed money to had made it clear that patience was no longer an option. According to Sam's reports, Derek had been forced to sell his car, his furniture, and even his professional equipment to make partial payments on his debts. He was living in increasingly desperate circumstances, moving from one cheap motel to another as his creditors tracked his movements. The restraining order I had obtained had prevented Derek from contacting Catherine directly, but it hadn't stopped him from attempting to reach her through intermediaries. These attempts had become increasingly frantic as his situation deteriorated, suggesting that he viewed Catherine as his only potential source of salvation. But Catherine was in no position to help Derek, even if she had been inclined to do so. Her own legal problems and financial constraints made it impossible for her to provide the kind of assistance Derek needed, and her attorney had advised her that any contact with Derek could be used against her in both the criminal and divorce proceedings. The irony of Derek and Catherine's situation was particularly satisfying to me. They had planned to destroy me and start a new life together with what they believed would be half of my assets. Instead, they were both facing legal consequences, financial ruin, and the complete collapse of their individual lives. Their grand romance had become a mutual destruction pact. The broader consequences of their actions extended beyond their immediate circle. Catherine's parents had become social pariahs by association, finding themselves excluded from events and organizations where they had once been welcome. Linda's marriage had come under strain as her husband blamed her for enabling Catherine's affair through her silence and assistance. My brother Michael had attempted to maintain neutrality in the family dispute, but even his relationship with me had been affected by his connection to the situation. I had made it clear that anyone who provided aid or comfort to my betrayers would find their own relationship with me compromised. The message was clear and had been received throughout our extended family and social circle. Loyalty to Marcus Blackwood was absolute, and disloyalty carried permanent consequences. As I reviewed the latest developments in what had become the systematic destruction of everyone who had betrayed me, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. The people who had voted me out of the family were learning what life was like without the protection and provision I had provided. They were discovering that actions had consequences, that betrayal carried a price, and that Marcus Blackwood was not a man who forgave or forgot. But even more satisfying was the knowledge that this was still only the middle phase of their punishment. The legal proceedings would continue for months, during which time their circumstances would continue to deteriorate. The criminal trial for Catherine's theft charges would provide additional public humiliation and potential imprisonment. The complete dissolution of their financial security would leave them permanently dependent on employment they were poorly equipped to maintain. Most importantly, they would spend the rest of their lives knowing that their comfortable existence had been entirely dependent on the generosity of the man they had chosen to betray. Every day of struggle, every moment of desperation, every reminder of what they had lost would serve to reinforce the magnitude of their mistake. I had given them everything: love, security, opportunity, privilege, and they had repaid me with betrayal and planned destruction. Now they would experience what life was like without those gifts, and they would understand the true cost of their choices. The war was not over, but the victory was no longer in question. All that remained was to watch my enemies complete their own destruction through the consequences of their actions. Chapter 7. The Point of No Return. 3 months after the Christmas revelation, I received news that marked the beginning of the final phase of my revenge. Catherine had been indicted on felony theft charges. Derek Stone had been hospitalized again after another accident involving his creditors, and both Emma and James had made their most desperate play yet for reconciliation. The indictment came first, delivered by Robert Thorne with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from a perfectly executed legal strategy. The grand jury had reviewed the evidence Sam and I had compiled over months of investigation and concluded that Catherine's theft of marital assets constituted grand larceny under state law. The prosecution is offering a plea deal, Robert informed me during our morning meeting at his office. 18 months in minimum security prison, full restitution of the stolen funds, and 5 years probation. If she goes to trial and loses, she's looking at 3 to 5 years in state prison. The choice Catherine faced was delicious in its cruelty. She could accept the plea deal and spend over a year in prison, emerging with a permanent felony record that would make employment nearly impossible. Or she could risk a trial with evidence so overwhelming that conviction was virtually certain, potentially facing even harsher consequences. What's her attorney's recommendation? I asked. Martinez is pushing hard for the plea deal. She knows the evidence is insurmountable, and she's trying to minimize the damage. But Catherine is still holding out hope that you might be willing to drop the charges if she agrees to favorable divorce terms. I laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. Catherine still doesn't understand who she's dealing with. She thinks this is a negotiation where she has something to offer. Should I communicate that you're not interested in any settlement discussions? Absolutely. Catherine made her choice when she decided to betray me and steal from me. Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they may be. Derek Stone's second hospitalization had been more serious than the first. According to Sam's sources, the men Derek owed money to had decided that subtle intimidation was insufficient. This time, Derek had suffered a broken arm, several cracked ribs, and facial injuries that would require reconstructive surgery. The attack had served its intended purpose. Derek was now genuinely terrified for his life and willing to do anything to escape his creditors. He had attempted to flee the state, but his bail conditions and lack of resources had made that impossible. He was trapped in a city where dangerous men were actively hunting him, with no money, no allies, and no way out. But Derek's desperation had led him to make a crucial mistake. In violation of the restraining order, he had attempted to contact Catherine directly, begging her to find some way to help him escape his situation. The contact had been recorded by investigators, providing additional evidence for both the criminal charges against Catherine and potential new charges against Derek. More significantly, Derek's communication with Catherine had revealed information about their relationship that I found particularly useful. In his desperation, Derek had reminded Catherine of conversations where they had discussed not just stealing my money, but actually planning to have me killed once their relationship became public. The murder plot had never progressed beyond idle conversation, but the evidence of their discussions provided me with ammunition that would ensure Derek's complete destruction. Men who threatened my life, even in theory, faced consequences that went beyond financial ruin or social embarrassment. Emma and James had made their most desperate reconciliation attempt through an intermediary I hadn't expected, my elderly father, Richard Blackwood. At 82, my father was the patriarch of our family and one of the few people whose opinion had ever mattered to me. He had built the foundation for everything I had achieved, and his approval had always been important to my sense of self-worth. Emma and James had contacted their grandfather and convinced him to arrange a meeting where they could apologize and attempt to rebuild their relationship with me. My father, who had been largely unaware of the details of our family's collapse, had agreed to host a dinner where we could work things out like family. The dinner took place at my father's modest home in the neighborhood where I had grown up. Richard Blackwood had never sought wealth or status. He had built a small but successful plumbing business and lived comfortably but simply. His home was a stark contrast to the mansion where Emma and James had grown up, and I could see the discomfort in their faces as they sat in his small dining room. My father began the evening with a speech about the importance of family, about forgiveness, and about not letting pride destroy relationships that had taken decades to build. He spoke with the wisdom of a man who had seen enough of life to understand what really mattered, and his words carried the weight of genuine love for his family. Then Emma and James delivered their carefully rehearsed apologies. They claimed they had been manipulated by their mother, that they hadn't understood the full scope of her deception, and that they had learned from their mistakes. They spoke about their love for me, their regret for their actions, and their hope that we could rebuild our relationship. Their performance was polished and probably sincere on some level. They had clearly spent considerable time preparing their words, and they delivered them with a kind of emotional authenticity that might have moved a more sentimental man. But Marcus Blackwood was not a sentimental man, and their words revealed the fundamental flaw in their understanding of the situation. "You still don't get it," I said when they finished their speeches. "You think this is about hurt feelings or wounded pride. You think an apology and some tears can undo what you've done." I looked directly at Emma, then at James, ensuring they understood that my next words were meant for them specifically. "You didn't just hurt my feelings. You didn't just make a mistake. You actively participated in a conspiracy to destroy me financially and emotionally. You chose your mother's side in a war against me, and you provided aid and comfort to my enemies while lying to my face for months." Emma tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand to silence her. "More than that, you revealed something about your characters that I can never unsee. You show me that your loyalty, your love, your respect for me was conditional and temporary. You demonstrated that when tested, you would choose your own perceived advantage over your father's welfare." The room was completely silent now. My father looked troubled, beginning to understand that this situation was more serious than he had realized. Emma and James looked stricken, finally grasping that their apologies were not going to achieve the reconciliation they desperately needed. "In business," I continued, "when someone betrays me, I don't give them a second chance to do it again. I don't hope they've learned their lesson or trust that they'll do better in the future. I remove them permanently from any position where they can harm me again." I stood up from the table, straightening my jacket and preparing to leave. "You voted me out of the family, remember? You banned me from calling you family. Congratulations, you got exactly what you wanted. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your lives." My father tried to speak, but I shook my head. "Dad, I respect you more than anyone else in the world, but this isn't about family dynamics or pride. This is about consequences for actions. Emma and James made adult decisions to betray me, and they need to face adult consequences for those decisions." As I walked toward the door, James finally found his voice. "Dad, please. We're your children. We made mistakes, but we're still your blood." I turned back to look at him one final time. "No, James. You are my children. Now you're just two people who used to live in my house and spend my money. The relationship you destroyed was the only thing that made you special to me, and without that relationship, you're nothing more than strangers who happen to share some of my DNA." I left my father's house knowing that I would never see Emma and James again as anything other than cautionary tales about the price of betrayal. They had pushed for this meeting because they believed family bonds were stronger than consequences, because they thought blood was thicker than accountability. They had learned otherwise. The drive back to my hotel took me through the city I had helped build, past construction sites where my crews were working on projects that would outlast everyone who had betrayed me. The lights of the downtown district reflected off the windows of buildings that bore my company's signature, permanent monuments to the success I had achieved through intelligence, determination, and the absolute refusal to tolerate disloyalty. Emma, James, Catherine, and Derek had all made the same crucial error. They had mistaken my love and generosity for weakness. They had assumed that because I had provided for them and protected them, I would continue to do so regardless of how they treated me. They were learning that Marcus Blackwood's love came with expectations, that his generosity had limits, and that his protection was not unconditional. They were discovering that crossing me carried a price they were not prepared to pay. But most importantly, they were beginning to understand that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Chapter 8: Total Annihilation. 6 months after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, I stood in the courthouse lobby watching Catherine being led away in handcuffs. She had rejected the plea deal, convinced until the final moment that I would somehow relent and drop the charges. The jury had needed less than 3 hours to convict her on all counts of grand theft, and the judge had sentenced her to 4 years in state prison. As the bailiffs escorted her toward the transport vehicle that would take her to begin her sentence, Catherine looked back at me one final time. Her face was a portrait of complete devastation. The woman who had once been the envy of Pinehurst Estates now looked haggard and broken, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothing. "Marcus, please," she called out, her voice carrying across the courthouse lobby. "I'm still your wife. I'm still the mother of your children. This doesn't have to be the end." I met her eyes without expression, then turned and walked away. Catherine's desperate words followed me out of the building, but they meant nothing to me. She had made her choice long ago, and now she was living with the consequences. The divorce had been finalized the week before the criminal trial ended. Thanks to the prenuptial agreement and Catherine's theft of marital assets, she had received nothing except debt. I had kept the house, the business, all investments, and even her jewelry collection, which had been purchased with my money during our marriage. More satisfying than the financial victory was the knowledge that Catherine would emerge from prison with no resources, no prospects, and a felony record that would make rebuilding her life nearly impossible. She would serve her sentence knowing that her betrayal had cost her everything, and she would spend the rest of her life as a cautionary tale about the price of crossing Marcus Blackwood. Derek Stone's fate had been even more dramatic. The gambling debts I had orchestrated had continued to grow, and his creditors had finally run out of patience entirely. According to police reports, Derek had been found beaten nearly to death in an alley behind one of the downtown hotels. He survived, but his injuries were severe enough to require months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. While Derek recovered from his physical wounds, his legal problems had multiplied. The assault charges from his creditors were the least of his concerns. Investigators had discovered evidence of insurance fraud, tax evasion, and contract violations in his business dealings. The man who had seduced my wife was now facing multiple felony charges and civil lawsuits that would ensure he never recovered financially or professionally. But Derek's destruction wasn't complete until I had addressed the murder plot he and Catherine had discussed. Using the recorded conversations Sam had obtained, I had provided evidence to law enforcement that Derek had threatened my life. While the threats were too vague and theoretical to result in criminal charges, they had been sufficient to justify additional civil restraining orders and financial penalties that further destroyed his ability to rebuild his life. The final element of Derek's punishment came through channels that would never be traced back to me. The men Derek owed money to received anonymous information about certain valuable assets Derek had hidden from bankruptcy proceedings. When these assets were collected to satisfy his debts, Derek was left with absolutely nothing. No money, no property, no means of support, and no prospect of recovery. Derek Stone had entered my life as a successful businessman who thought he could steal my wife and half my wealth. He would leave it as a broken man facing years in prison, permanent financial ruin, and physical disabilities that would serve as daily reminders of the price he had paid for his betrayal. Emma and James had experienced their own complete collapse, though their destruction had been more psychological than physical. The loss of their trust funds, college funding, and family support had forced them into a world they were completely unprepared to navigate. Emma had been evicted from her apartment near Stanford after falling behind on rent. Her attempts to find employment that would support her previous lifestyle had failed consistently, and she had been forced to take multiple minimum wage jobs just to afford basic housing and food. The confidence and entitlement that had defined her personality had been replaced by desperation and bitterness. James had fared slightly better initially, finding work as a construction laborer with a company that hadn't heard about his family scandal. But his lack of physical conditioning and work ethic had made him unsuitable for manual labor, and he had been fired within 6 weeks. His artistic aspirations had proven worthless in the practical world, leaving him with no marketable skills and no financial resources. Both children had attempted multiple times to contact me through various intermediaries, but I had made my position clear to everyone in our extended family and social circle. Anyone who aided Emma and James in any way would find their own relationship with me permanently severed. The message had been received clearly. Neither my brother Michael nor any other family members were willing to risk their own security by helping the children who had betrayed me. Emma and James were truly alone in the world, abandoned by the family they had taken for granted and forced to survive on their own limited abilities. The psychological impact of their circumstances had been devastating. According to reports from mutual acquaintances, both children had experienced complete personality changes. Emma, once confident and outgoing, had become withdrawn and suspicious. James, formerly optimistic and creative, had developed signs of clinical depression that went untreated due to his lack of health insurance. Most importantly, both Emma and James had been forced to confront the reality that their comfortable lives had been entirely dependent on my generosity and protection. Every day of struggle, every moment of uncertainty, every reminder of what they had lost served to reinforce the magnitude of their betrayal and the finality of its consequences. The broader effects of my revenge had rippled through our entire social and professional network. Catherine's parents had become social outcasts, their reputation permanently tainted by association with their daughter's crimes. Linda's marriage had ended in divorce when her husband discovered the extent of her knowledge about Catherine's affair and her failure to warn me. Several of Catherine's friends who had known about the affair but remained silent had found themselves excluded from social events and professional opportunities as word spread about their complicity in her deception. The message was clear. Loyalty to Marcus Blackwood was absolute, and those who failed to meet that standard would face consequences. In the business world, my reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by the scandal. Other successful men respected the thoroughness of my revenge and the finality of the consequences I had imposed on those who betrayed me. Several major contracts had come my way specifically because potential clients wanted to work with someone they knew would be absolutely loyal and completely ruthless toward anyone who crossed them. As I stood in my new office, a larger, more impressive space in the city's premier business district, I looked out over the urban landscape I had helped create and felt a sense of completion I had never experienced before. Every person who had betrayed me had been systematically destroyed. Every element of the comfortable life they had taken for granted had been stripped away. Every relationship they valued had been severed permanently. Catherine would spend the next 4 years in prison, emerging as a middle-aged woman with no resources, no prospects, and no support system. Derek would face his own prison sentence, followed by a lifetime of debt, disability, and social isolation. Emma and James would spend the rest of their lives understanding that actions have consequences and that some mistakes can never be undone. Most importantly, everyone who knew me now understood exactly what happened to people who betrayed Marcus Blackwood. My reputation for loyalty, generosity, and protection was matched by an equally strong reputation for absolute ruthlessness toward those who violated my trust. The war that had begun with Catherine's affair and culminated in the Christmas dinner confrontation was finally over. I had achieved total victory over my enemies, and they would spend the rest of their lives as living examples of the price of crossing me. But victory, I was learning, was only the beginning of the next phase of my life. I had destroyed my enemies, but now I needed to build something new from the ashes of my former family. That construction project would require the same intelligence, determination, and ruthless execution that had made my revenge so complete. And Marcus Blackwood had never failed to complete a construction project. Chapter 9. The New Foundation. 1 year after the Christmas revelation, I stood at the altar of St. Michael's Cathedral, watching the most beautiful woman I had ever seen walk down the aisle toward me. Victoria Sterling was 34 years old, a successful pediatric surgeon with her own wealth and social standing, and she had entered my life at exactly the moment when I was ready to build something new from the ashes of my former family. Victoria was everything Catherine had never been: independent, accomplished, honest, and genuinely devoted to me rather than to the lifestyle I could provide. She had her own career, her own money, and her own social circle, which meant she chose to be with me because of who I was, not what I could give her. We had met at a charity gala 8 months earlier, introduced by mutual friends who thought we would make a good match. Victoria had been immediately intrigued by my reputation, not just as a successful businessman, but as a man who dealt with betrayal in absolute terms. She respected strength and decisive action, qualities that her previous relationships had lacked. Our courtship had been conducted with the same methodical precision I brought to business dealings. I had Sam Rodriguez conduct a thorough background investigation to ensure Victoria was exactly who she appeared to be. I had my attorney draft an airtight prenuptial agreement that protected both of our assets. Most importantly, I had made it clear from the beginning that loyalty was not negotiable in any relationship with me. Victoria had not only accepted these conditions, but had appreciated them. She understood that a man who had built what I had built required absolute trust and loyalty from his partner, and she was prepared to provide both without reservation. The wedding ceremony was a masterpiece of elegance and power. The guest list included governors, senators, business leaders, and celebrities. People who understood that witnessing Marcus Blackwood's second marriage was both an honor and a statement about their own social position. The absence of my former family was noted by everyone present, serving as a permanent reminder of what happened to people who betrayed me. As Victoria and I exchanged vows, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. This was not the desperate contentment I had felt in my first marriage, when I had convinced myself that providing for an ungrateful family was sufficient purpose for my life. This was the deep satisfaction of a man who had destroyed his enemies and built something new and better from their ashes. After the ceremony, as Victoria and I greeted our guests at the reception, I received updates on the ongoing consequences my former family continued to face. Catherine had been released from prison 6 months early for good behavior, but her freedom had brought no relief from the consequences of her actions. She was living in a halfway house in one of the city's worst neighborhoods, working as a night shift cleaner at a medical facility, and struggling with health problems that had developed during her incarceration. Her attempts to rebuild her life had been consistently thwarted by her felony record and complete lack of resources. Every job application, every rental application, every attempt to rejoin society was met with rejection when background checks revealed her criminal history. She was trapped in a cycle of poverty and isolation that would likely continue for the rest of her life. More significantly, Catherine had finally understood the permanence of her situation. According to reports from mutual acquaintances, she had stopped trying to contact me or seek reconciliation. She had accepted that her betrayal had cost her everything and that there was no path back to the life she had destroyed. Derek Stone had completed his own prison sentence and emerged even more broken than Catherine. His gambling debts had been legally discharged through bankruptcy proceedings, but the physical and psychological damage from his beating had left him permanently disabled. He walked with a limp, suffered from chronic pain, and had developed anxiety disorders that made normal social interaction difficult. Derek's professional reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that he could not find work in his field under his own name. He had been forced to take a job as a stockroom clerk at a large retail store, earning barely enough to survive in a small apartment in the same neighborhood where Catherine lived. The sophisticated, charming man who had seduced my wife had been reduced to a broken shell of his former self. Emma and James had experienced different forms of complete life collapse. Emma had eventually found steady employment as a manager at a chain restaurant, but her salary was barely sufficient to support the kind of basic lifestyle she had never imagined living. She remained unmarried, unable to attract partners from the social class she had grown up in, and unwilling to settle for men who matched her current circumstances. James had struggled even more severely. His artistic temperament and lack of practical skills had made consistent employment nearly impossible. He had moved from job to job, city to city, never able to establish the kind of stable life he had taken for granted as my son. His attempts to pursue artistic careers had failed consistently, leaving him bitter and increasingly isolated. Both of my former children had aged prematurely under the stress of their circumstances. Friends who encountered them reported that they looked older than their years, carried themselves with the defeated posture of people who had learned that life could be cruel and unforgiving. Most satisfying to me was the knowledge that Emma and James understood exactly why their lives had collapsed. They knew their circumstances were the direct result of their betrayal, and they lived every day with the knowledge that their comfortable futures had been permanently destroyed by their own choices. As Victoria and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, I reflected on the comprehensive nature of my victory over everyone who had betrayed me. I had not simply defeated them. I had erased them from any position of significance in the world. They continued to exist, but only as cautionary tales about the consequences of crossing Marcus Blackwood. The new life I was building with Victoria would be constructed on the foundation of absolute loyalty and mutual respect. She understood what had happened to my previous family and why, and she approved of the thoroughness of my response to their betrayal. Victoria was a woman who respected strength and decisive action, qualities that would ensure our relationship remained honest and faithful. Over the following months, Victoria and I began building not just a marriage, but an empire that would surpass anything I had achieved with my first family. Her connections in the medical community opened new opportunities for my construction business, while my resources allowed her to expand her surgical practice and pursue research interests she had never been able to afford. We purchased a estate that dwarfed my former mansion, designed and built to our exact specifications with security systems that ensured our privacy and protection. The house became a symbol of what could be achieved when two successful people built something together based on mutual respect rather than dependency and entitlement. Most importantly, Victoria and I began planning for children who would grow up understanding the values that had made our success possible: loyalty, hard work, honesty, and the absolute certainty that actions have consequences. Our children would never take their privileges for granted, because they would understand from an early age that those privileges were earned through merit and maintained through loyalty. As our first anniversary approached, I stood in the study of our new home, looking at photographs from our wedding and reflecting on the completeness of my transformation. 1 year earlier, I had been a man betrayed by everyone closest to him, a man whose generosity and love had been repaid with lies and planned destruction. Now, I was a man who had systematically destroyed his enemies and built something new and better from their ashes. I had a wife who loved and respected me for who I was, not what I could provide. I had business partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided dependence. I had a reputation that ensured no one would ever again mistake my kindness for weakness. The final element of my victory came in the form of news about my former family's continued decline. Catherine had been hospitalized after a workplace accident, with no insurance and no family support to help with her recovery. Derek had been evicted from his apartment and was living in a homeless shelter. Emma had been arrested for shoplifting, a crime born of desperation and poor judgment. James had disappeared entirely, with no one knowing his current location or circumstances. Each piece of news about their ongoing struggles brought me satisfaction, not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because it confirmed the justice of their consequences. They had chosen to betray the man who had given them everything, and now they were experiencing what life was like without his protection and provision. As I prepared for bed that night, Victoria beside me reading medical journals, and preparing for the next day's surgeries, I felt the deep contentment that comes from having achieved total victory over one's enemies and having built something new and better in their place. Marcus Blackwood had learned the most valuable lesson of his life, that loyalty must be absolute, that consequences must match actions, and that some betrayals can never be forgiven or forgotten. But most importantly, I had learned that destruction, when properly executed, becomes the foundation for something stronger and better than what came before. The game was over, and I had won completely.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.